So can we, I want to just talk about one more phenomenon, which is the modern phenomenon of what is called gentrification. Can you talk about the effect of gentrification,
Sure.
what gentrification is and what its effect is on the sort of the spatial arrangement of Richmond today?
So what we see in Richmond and throughout the United States is these purposefully underdeveloped communities become places of profound disappointment by the early 21st century. And the property values and the economic value of these spaces, because of the historical legacy of these laws and these private and public actions, create now what we become synonymous with good and bad neighborhoods. And these are bad neighborhoods that are undervalued. Public schools follow. The lack of resources, food deserts. These places are generally hotter than other communities because they don't have green spaces. So they don't come with the same types of value that you see in other communities. Well, for most of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, the fear of moving these places somehow kept the economic incentives at bay. The economic incentives had finally eclipsed the fear. And what we are beginning to see is that people recognize that there is value in living close to the core of a city, that many of these houses are beautiful and they can be refurbished. So what gentrification is, and scholars argue about what it is and what it is not, but the easiest way to measure it is taking a point in time and saying, this is what the educational level was in this space. This is what the economic level was in this space, or in this neighborhood, or this enclave. And this is, what the age was of the person who lived in a single dwelling home. And then you measure that against the rate of change. And if the economic level goes up, if the schools go up, the educational level goes up. If business culture starts to move into a space, we recognize that something is happening, right? And that something that's happening is referred to as gentrification. Is that there is a kind of inward migration of people who traditionally wouldn't have lived in this neighborhood that are raising property values. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily enhancing the quality of life per se. I walk past, I live in Brooklyn Park. I walked past a sign one day and said, building community, as if community didn't exist there before, right? Right. But that's what gentrification is a demographic change in a neighborhood characterized by rising levels of education and economic.
When you say building community, I mean, I think that is sort of the way that often these projects are imagined, which is in the same way that colonization or the expansion of cities imagines empty space to be conquered. Sort of these spaces are being reimagined as spaces to develop a new community, right? It ignores the existence of the existing residents, the community that has been built, and they're.
Oh yeah, it's built on the backs. Here we are again, where African Americans and people in these communities are being sacrificed at the altar of modernity, right? For instance, the city of Richmond has historical tax credits and historical tax abatements to incentivize people to move into older homes and purchase older buildings to repurpose them and to live in them. I live in a house with a historical tax abatement. And well, if a city can do that to encourage people to move into a neighborhood, why can't it then have, for instance, a policy that safeguards people on fixed incomes, right? From the kinds of vulnerabilities that they are going to endure when their property value goes up and their tax rate goes up. Why can't you have a graduated increase or freeze? If someone is over the age of 65 and they've been in a home, why do they have to suffer through rising tax increases, in large part because of the people who are moving into their neighborhood? My ultimate point is, if you can incentivize people to moving into a neighborhood with recourse to public policy, then you can encourage people to stay with recourse to public policy, right? And not doing that is deeply disingenuous. So the city of Richmond can create this the community, the Office of Community Wealth Building on the one hand, yay for us, gold star, right? But then it has these historic tax credits and tax abatements that are encouraging people to move in, right? And force folks out. The poverty rate is growing in the suburbs, right? Faster than, it's just what I'm finding in the city and throughout the United States is that we've come up with plans to try and reinvigorate these neighborhoods without imagining how the people who live there might be able to bring their expertise and their experiences to bear on making these actually diverse communities, not transitionally diverse, but diverse for the long run.
Yeah.
Right.
So one of the things that I want to get back to some of those solutions, but one of the things that our students at VCU are really interested in is the role that VCU plays in the city of Richmond, and particularly as a force of development and gentrification. Right, like VCU has its Monroe Park campus on one side of Jackson Ward, and it's MCV on the other side. Which, by the way, it's the expansion of MCV was aided by the demolition of Navy Hill, and the construction of the freeway. Right, so it sits between this historic black neighborhood. VCU has its own ideas about what it wants the neighborhoods around VCU to look like. It has ideas about expansion. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what role VCU plays in the gentrification development of Richmond.
Here we are again with the unintended consequences of these bad public policies in the mid-20th century, right? The federal government had a suburban strategy for about 50 years, for most of the second part of the 20th century, where they literally let inner cities and core urban areas cave in on themselves. So much so that the city of Richmond would have done anything, right? You get what we call these silver bullet strategies in the 1980s and the 1990s to try and reinvigorate cities by increasing tax bases, right? One such strategy, right, in a city of Richmond or a city like Richmond is to give VCU carte blanche, right? Because they needed VCU in the 1980s and the 1990s because no one wanted to invest in the city. So the first thing VCU has to do is recognize, the first thing the city has to do is recognize that, of course, VCU played an integral part in reinvigorating the core of Richmond. But it played an integral part in reinvigorating the core of Richmond because of these bad public policies that had been around for years. And VCU has to become self-aware of the role it played. And it can pat itself on the back for the role it played in helping reinvigorate the city, but recognize that that can't be the path moving forward, right? It will not be the only player in town moving forward, in large part because now people actually want to move to the city. So I think it's going to be interesting to see the extent to which VCU can rein itself in, right? From the free reign, from the relative free reign it has had in redeveloping and reinvigorating the inner city of Richmond, right? And it would be deeply ironic, given the level of expertise at VCU, that this wouldn't be part of the conversation. Like, what role? I mean, think of it this way. There's money in Black poverty, and nobody knows that better than VCU. College grant writing, Black poverty, right? The gobbling up of old Black neighborhoods, Black poverty, right? Volunteer work in Richmond, Black poverty. We have, and I always say this to my colleagues at the University of Richmond, we should be trying to come up with plans to eradicate the necessity for us to do these things. Why, if we're continuing to do volunteer work in the city of Richmond, that means we're not doing anything because nothing is changing. What VCU needs to be thinking more intently about, and the University of Richmond, is finally actually coming to terms with the appalling continuity of Black poverty in Richmond and what can finally do, right, to make this a livable city with a thriving intellectual community that doesn't depend on Black poverty to legitimize.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit more about that? What does, I guess, number one, development look like without displacement and in a way that is actually geared toward building up rather than displacing the Black community? And second of all, when we think about development in that sense, does there need to be an acknowledgement of and perhaps reparations for the historic, theft of wealth from the Black community?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to do is ask the people in these communities what they want, right? Okay. For far too long, this has been a one-way street, where people telling these folks what they need, in large part because there's a kind of paternalism when we think about Black poverty, is that we know what's best for the people who live in these communities. We actually have to finally institute a democratic process into the decision-making when it comes to how we reinvigorate, right? The problem is, I think one of the biggest mistakes that in American history was the compression of poverty into public housing throughout the United States, but in cities like Richmond. in large part because it's been very hard to meet the generational challenges that emerged because of that compression. And we have got to find a way to get folks in the projects to believe that the system can work for them. And the best way to reinvigorate that process is giving them a stake in the decision-making process. Because come on, man, you know, I grew up in and around public housing. Half these folks in public housing, especially Black folks, only see white people when they're coming to make a decision on their behalf, when they're coming as social workers or police officers to tell them what to do, right? So they're mistrustful of the right of institutional whiteness in large part because it works against them. So the best way I think that we can make inroads into these communities in good faith is to allow them to tell us what they need, right? And what we can do, we need to do more listening, you know, and I mean that, and I'm talking about experts. I'm talking about somebody who talks for a living, you know what I'm saying? We need to do more listening. And I think that's the first step. I think we need to have a proverbial, we have never had a moment like they had in South Africa of reconciliation. To your point about how do we repay the debt? The first way to do it is you cannot have reconciliation without recognition. We have to recognize what has happened. We have to listen to the folks who are the victims of this history. And then I think we can come up with the types of design strategies that we need to move the conversation forward and try to get this city on some viable path, right, toward a thriving and better future.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it's so important to shift the framework of, or sort of the mindset of Americans, which I think is in many respects, you know, still geared toward the idea that if you're poor, you deserve to be poor. That's your fault. That's your bad. Rather than we have actually manufactured wealth. We have manufactured poverty. This can actually be documented and traced, and we need to actually take stock of the responsibility that we have to solve the problems that our society, our government, our institutions have created.
It's that you're not like, it's the biggest tragedy, I think, in American history and American contemporary life, is I think that many Americans believed and continue to believe that the further we get away from our tortured racial history in the 20th century, that bigotry and racism would just dissipate into the atmosphere organically, that we would just be better off, right, by time and space. And what we're recognizing now, to your point, is that things done on purpose can only be undone purposefully. This shit happened for a reason. People made decisions, institutionalized decisions based on race and class that cannot be undone simply by wishing that it goes away. There needs to be a purposeful campaign, well engineered and meticulous, on how we can come to terms with the kinds of disinvestment that have given rise to many of the problems that we're still trying to deal with. I mean, who doesn't know that the kind of the ugly cousin of residential segregation was white policing, right? And where Black communities are contained, right? Where we all know where they're pathologized and over policed, and there's a shocking predictability between white officers and Black folks, and the unintended or the intended outcome or unintended outcome is violence. This is all part of the same tapestry, and we're not being honest about what happened, and we're not being purposeful about how we can come to terms with it, because we don't understand how purposeful it was to begin with. Right?
So these are big problems, and a question that we're asking our, you know, the people we're interviewing is, you know, what are some of the ways that you think average people can address racism in the United States? Like, what is the advice that you maybe give to students, give to colleagues, give to friends? Like, how do you think about, sort of on a personal level, the average person can address some of these problems, and more broadly, racism in the United States?
So, you know, I think I'm a historian, so I think about historical solutions to contemporary problems, but I see something year after year as a professor, that generations of young people are arriving on college campuses with no understanding of this history, right? This isn't a crisis of the boomer generation, right? The boomer generation in some ways is responsible for the fact that these young folks don't know this history. It hasn't been institutionalized. It hasn't been told, right? We're just now coming to terms with slavery. And, you know, and I think if we don't recognize, the first thing to moving this conversation forward is recognizing this history exists. Part of the reason I think we struggle with coming to terms with institutionalized racism is because people don't know, like, concretely how it worked, like where the real examples are. And if we could, I mean, you tell people, even a die-in-the-wool bigot walks through the fire of redlining and housing discrimination would be like, oh, wow, I had no idea. And here's the beauty of the 20th century. There are more than enough public records about this. We're not, right? This was all documented, right? This stuff has been recorded and documented. This isn't, you know, we're not pulling from limited source material here. I think the first step to moving the needle forward is just recognizing that something took place. It's the 3 phases of trauma recovery, right? The first step of trauma recovery is recognition, right? And I think we are dealing with the kind of communal trauma from this history. And we're far enough from the 20th century now where I think we could actually do a decent job of getting people to understand how we got to now, right? Like, well, why? You know, we think of it, you know, this is why, you know, people at the University of Richmond, and I'll trust me, I'm answering your question in a roundabout way, why we struggle with DEI initiatives on college campuses. Like, are you kidding me? I said, most professors were raised in racially homogenous communities, right? Most kids come from them. And most of the people that work in the service of this university go back to them when they clock out of work. And we wonder, these are abstract ideas in large part because they don't comport with how we live. And I think we need to recognize, we need to teach folks that where and how they live was a consequence of a series of human decisions, right? The institutionalization of those decisions and preferences about race that in some ways were shaded by the slave system. And if we could knit that together in a usable way, this is usable history. It will get people a little bit closer to understanding how we got to now. And I think that's the first component. And then going to the next phase, well, like, what can we do to atone and make good on the promise of American democracy and upward mobility?
Well, I think that's a really good place to sign off. Dr. Hayter, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your expertise with me and with our students.
My pleasure.